Hi folks, and welcome to another episode in a video series presented by KupoCon, where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in the remake. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of the unofficial Final Fantasy VII Novelisation, the standalone novel The Nibelheim Incident, which is now an audio series also produced by KupoCon, as well as my latest book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII. The purpose of this series is to discuss a lot of the detail hidden within the remake, and to provide a broader understanding for new and veteran fans alike. In the last episode, I examined the second half of Chapter 13, A Broken World, covering Cloud, Barret and Tifa's descent into the underground test site, their encounter with the unknown specimens, and the eventual rescue of Wedge. This time around, I'll be analysing the opening to Chapter 14, itself titled In Search of Hope. The video will inherently include spoilers for this section of the game, but anything beyond Chapter 14 is minimal and mainly speculation. However, as always, if you're not familiar with the original story, there will very likely be heavy spoilers, and if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Chapter 14 begins with the party having returned to Elmira's house with the injured Wedge. Barret apologises for placing the burden of looking after him on Aerith's mother, but she responds by saying she would never leave a wounded man out on the street. This may be an attitude she adopted during wartime, derived from the loss of her husband, but it's also worth pointing out a vague allusion to the combatants shown fighting outside her home in the recent trailer for the Battle Royale mobile game, The First Soldier. That said, these battles very likely existed in a virtual reality, so she should have no knowledge of them. Cloud soon changes the subject to rescuing Aerith from Shinra, referencing their discovery of human experimentation at the underground lab in the last chapter. He grows rather passionate about his point, especially regarding how the company's scientists view and treat their test subjects. Note Cloud's use of the phrase "we're all just numbers and meat" when he specifically mentions Hojo. Knowing what type of man Shinra's top scientist truly is at this point isn't exactly a retcon on Cloud's part, but it does raise a few questions. In the original game, Professor Hojo is introduced at the executive meeting during the party's infiltration of Shinra headquarters. Both Cloud and Barret are already aware of who Hojo is, but Cloud remarks that he has never seen him in person before. His delivery of the line implies he has no real feelings towards the man, which, given his amnesia regarding events following the Nibelheim tragedy, makes perfect sense. So why does he seem so disgusted with the scientist in Remake? Especially since Cloud's history as a security division grunt is unlikely to have given him access to Hojo or classified information. Well, as I highlighted in the last video, his visions while viewing the Mako capsules at the underground lab indicate Cloud appears to have a subconscious recollection of his time in the basement of Shinra Manor. If so, he may also have a vague understanding that Hojo is directly connected to that. Alternatively, his reaction might have been triggered by the part of his psyche comprised of Zack's memories, because Zack had numerous interactions with Hojo during Crisis Core. Elmira allows the group to stay the night while she deliberates what to do about Aerith's situation. Cloud wakes from his slumber to a noise on the stairs and slowly gathers himself to go and investigate. What will follow is one of 3 scenes, depending on the choices made by the player in previous chapters. If you complete all the side quests in Sector 7, or show preference to Tifa, the forthcoming scene will involve her. If you complete all the side quests in Sector 5, or show preference to Aerith, the scene will involve her. If you don't complete all the side quests and don't show any preference in your options, the scene will involve Barret. Veteran fans will of course recognise that this is very reminiscent of the mechanics used in the old game, to determine which of these 3 characters, or Yuffie, Cloud takes on a date at the Gold Saucer. During his conversation with Tifa, she brings up the yellow flower that he gave to her back in Chapter 3, having come to the realisation that he must have acquired it from Aerith. She reiterates that this particular type symbolises reunion, though Tifa uses the term more broadly than Aerith does in Chapter 2, where she said that lovers would give them to each other when they were reunited. As was pointed out to me by YouTube user Serge Volosin, Tifa's wording is much closer in context to the remake's Japanese script. As such, Aerith giving the yellow flower to Cloud, who in turn gives it to Tifa, is open to personal interpretation about whether these exchanges represent the characters being reunited in a romantic sense, a friendship sense, a story sense, or otherwise. Tifa goes on to remark that she tried to keep the flower alive as long as possible, but that it's now dead and buried, along with Seventh Heaven and their home. It could have been argued that by home, she is referring to Stargazer Heights, but the follow-up line when she puts her head on Cloud's shoulder is, "They took everything from us, again." She is of course talking about their hometown, Nibelheim, being burned to the ground by Sephiroth, who, at the time, was the leader of a Shinra investigation team. This is also the first instance in the game that Tifa vocally acknowledges the tragedy at Nibelheim, as her dialogue in chapters 3, 6 and 7 in particular deliberately dances around the subject. It's important to keep in mind that, as far as Tifa is aware, Cloud was not present during the events there. Cloud, being his awkward self, doesn't know how to react while Tifa is sobbing against his shoulder. He is clearly affected, however, as seen by the tears welling in his eyes. He wants to comfort her in this moment, but their shared trauma has paralysed him. It is a powerful visual when Cloud does eventually embrace Tifa, especially when the camera angle switches to show the sky, through the gap where the Sector 7 plate should be. It's a real display of the deepening bond between the two, which is crucial because contrary to how their relationship is portrayed in the early parts of the story, Cloud and Tifa were not actually close in their childhood, as I explained in my Chapter 4 video. If the player gets the scene with Barret instead of Tifa, the conversation plays out pretty differently. Cloud finds his giant comrade on the raised flower garden, gazing towards Sector 7. Barret begins to talk about Avalanche members other than the main characters we know of his cell. He references a boy called Finn, who I've mentioned in previous videos, as he is the one responsible for all the stamp graffiti found in the game. This is mere conjecture, but I wonder if the name is related to the old American cartoon Huckleberry Hound, a canine character who was in turn based on Mark Twain's classic novels Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This may also provide a possible connection to the advertisements shown around Final Fantasy VII Remake for Book 3 of the Adventures of Stamp. Barret also mentions Al, the intel guy, who had tricks for stealing codes. It's very likely he's the one Jessie was referring to way back in Chapter 1, the person who provided her with the codes for infiltrating Mako Reactor 1, after everyone else at Avalanche Command refused to speak to Barret's cell. It's also possible that Al's knack for obtaining stolen codes relates to Avalanche moles in Shinra headquarters, at least 2 of whom we encounter later in the remake. According to Barret, Al is also something of a ladies' man, and even tried his flower trick on Tifa once. Cloud's reaction to this is priceless, be it either a glimpse of his jealousy as a love interest, or simply as a protective friend. Barret lastly mentions Nellie, the quartermaster for Midgar's Avalanche cell, and establishes that she and Al know each other, as well as her close relationship with Jessie. A quartermaster in a military context is typically an officer who oversees the distribution of supplies. As my friend Vizuvazad at the Cosmo Canyon Observatory channel has pointed out, Nellie is very likely the supplier Jessie refers to at the beginning of Chapter 4, when discussing her need for a blasting agent. As a side note, both Nellie and Finn appear on the darts scoreboard found in 7th Heaven. At the end of the conversation, Barret tells Cloud he'll introduce him to the others after they've saved Aerith. While this is almost certainly Barret being in denial over the likelihood of his colleagues' deaths in the Sector 7 plate collapse, there's a slim possibility it's a meta-reference to the player. Despite being named characters with a brief history that far exceeds most NPCs in Remake, the trio were never shown on screen. It was speculated by many, myself included, that all 3 were due to appear in Episode Intermission, the Remake DLC featuring Yuffie Kisaragi's team-up with Midgar's Avalanche HQ. We believed we had already seen Finn, Al and Nellie during Intergrade's trailer, specifically in the scene at the basement hideout. The meta reference to players may be that Remake's climax completes the rescue of Aerith, but the next story content will be found during the DLC, introducing us to the Avalanche 3. Official biographies, however, have since confirmed these characters to be called Poke, Billy Bob and Neo. That said, whether those are their true names or simply aliases remains to be seen. I'd also like to give a massive thank you to my friend and community hero Schrodinger's Baby Seal for capturing the footage for me in this section. Like Tifa and Barret, Aerith also has a unique scene with Cloud, depending on the player's previous choices. Hers is a bit different though, because we know she can't physically be present at this time, thus implying that Cloud is dreaming. Exiting the bedroom, Cloud catches a glimpse of Aerith walking down the stairs, so he follows her outside. This introduction differs slightly from the other 2, where Cloud either finds Tifa and Marlene's bedroom door ajar, or wakes to discover his own door open, and Barret missing from his spot beside Wedge's bed. Veteran fans will already be aware that this is not the first time in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII that Aerith has appeared to Cloud in a dream. It happens several times during Advent Children, while he's unconscious or distracted. But the key precedent lies in the original game, specifically in the scene that follows the events at the Temple of the Ancients. After Cloud hands over the black materia to Sephiroth, he falls into a comatose state and envisions himself in the sleeping forest with Aerith, which is exactly the same scene I spoke about in the first episode of my Chapter 9 video trilogy. Anyway, During that dream, Cloud initially communicates with Aerith remotely, then physically materialises alongside her. The importance of this conversation cannot be overstated, because it is their last exchange before her death. Cloud subsequently wakes up at the tavern in Gallagher, in the company of, as it happens, Tifa and Barret. Of course, it isn't impossible that Cloud is hallucinating this interaction, just as he's done with Sephiroth in previous chapters of Remake. But it does feel as if this scene has been presented in quite a distinct way. So why is it vital to establish straight away that Cloud is dreaming here? Well, the short answer is context. The question is not necessarily how Aerith is communicating with Cloud. It may be more about where and even when she is communicating from. As Cloud approaches Aerith at the elevated flower patch, he himself seems to realise that this is not real, with the camera lingering on the starry backdrop, which I'll come back to in a minute. Aerith doesn't give a straight answer when asked if this is a dream, suggesting something else is at play. Keep in mind that if Cloud is not physically awake, she is by definition communicating with his subconscious. When Cloud asks if she is alright, Aerith tells him that she used to live in the Shinra building, which provides clarification on Elmira's comment in Chapter 13 about the girl escaping from some research facility when she was a child. This might not have been obvious to new players. Something important to note here is that Aerith says, "It kinda feels like I've gone back to my childhood home," which is delivered in the present tense, thus initially indicating the conversation is taking place with the Aerith currently at Shinra HQ. Cloud goes on to admit that he's worried about her, with very little hesitation when Aerith queries it. As I mentioned before, this is Cloud's subconscious, so his feelings are presented far more openly than, say, by comparison, his paralysing uncertainty when Tifa is sobbing on his shoulder. Changing the conversation, Aerith turns towards the great ethereal spectacle against the starlit sky, clasping her hands in prayer. The stars and jade plumes are pretty reminiscent of the original Final Fantasy VII's opening movie, where Aerith is inspecting the Mako leak in the alley behind the theatre, and where she and Cloud ultimately cross paths for the first time. In this scene, Aerith closes her eyes and says, "Everyone dies eventually." There's quite a bit to deconstruct from this. While neither Cloud nor Aerith mention the word livestream explicitly here, it's clear the ex-soldier recognises that the jade green swells are the planet's Sea of Souls. The concept has not yet been explored in Remake, but the livestream plays a large role in the wider compilation. In particular, Aerith's consciousness joins the livestream upon her death at the hands of Sephiroth, but she uses her Cetran abilities to retain her form and identity. It is for this very reason that Aerith is able to communicate with Cloud's subconscious during the events of Advent Children. Throughout the original Final Fantasy VII, Aerith is typically seen to put her hands together in prayer when she is communicating with the planet. The most famous example of this is when she's at the water altar in the City of the Ancients, utilising her deep connection with the planet there to activate Holy. This, of course, is where Aerith dies, and thus joins the livestream. Providing the context here helps to explain the line "everyone dies eventually", but not really why she has chosen to say it. Specifically, she is foreshadowing an event that has not yet come to pass in Remake. This is further supplemented by Aerith's subsequent dialogue, where she tells Cloud she is grateful for having met him, grateful for everything they've shared, all the words, moments, and memories. Given that they have only spent a day in each other's company in terms of the remake's chronology, this line simply screams of a broader context. To have such an understanding of her wider relationship with Cloud, Aerith must be aware of the future. This, once again, plays into the importance of the yellow flowers symbolising a reunion of two people, as I spoke of in my Chapter 2 and 8 videos. Quite literally, from Aerith's perspective, the events of Chapters 8 through 12 feel like she is being reunited with a loved one. And, speaking of love, Aerith's monologue about her appreciation for Cloud comes with a huge caveat. She tells him that whatever happens, he cannot fall in love with her, because any romantic feelings he may have are not real. The implication here is that Aerith already knows about Cloud's fragmented psyche, and that his identity as an ex-soldier is an amalgamation of various contributing factors, one of which is Zack's memories and personality. Zack was Aerith's first serious boyfriend, so she fears that Cloud's feelings towards her are not his own, but rather remnants of Zack's. She voices these observations in the original game as well, during the gondola ride at the Gold Saucer, where if Aerith accompanies Cloud on a date at Enchantment Evening, she will tell him that she wants to meet the real him. Irrespective of how the player wishes to interpret Cloud and Aerith's relationship, what's unusual about her remarks here in Remake is that it suggests she does not wish for Cloud to be as deeply affected by future events as he might have been. Given that his eventual mental breakdown following her death is the catalyst for Sephiroth summoning Meteor in the old game, and that a core plot element of Advent Children is Cloud overcoming his grief, I would speculate the line is yet more evidence that Aerith intends to change the future. When Cloud tries to grab Aerith's hand, his arm passes through hers like a ghost, leaving only a flurry of spirit energy. These jade green particles are the same as those I discussed way back in the pilot episode, both in regards to how it represents organic enemies returning to the livestream upon their defeat, and how it also later connects this to the Mako pools at the core of Reactor 1. The visuals here are crucial, because they signify that the Aerith Cloud is speaking with is in fact comprised of spirit energy, rather than being a hallucination, the way Sephiroth has repeatedly appeared before now. Existing in such a form typically only occurs after someone has died and merged with the livestream, though Kodaj, Loz and Yuzu of Advent Children are exceptions, but I'll address that at a later time. Therefore, we can deduce that the Aerith in this scene is not the one presently sitting in Shinra headquarters, but instead one who has already been killed by Sephiroth in the future. She is speaking from the afterlife, which in turn explains the presence of the livestream swells in the background. Furthermore, if we assume the tense used by Aerith when she initially refers to the Shinra building being her childhood home is not incorrect, the implication would be that time is not structured the same way in the livestream. As it happens, this exact concept has already been raised in the official novel On the Way to a Smile, authored by Final Fantasy VII scenario writer Kazushige Nojima. One final point to note is that at the end of the sequence, Cloud wakes up in the bedroom again. This does not happen after the corresponding Tifa and Barret scenes, additionally confirming that his exchange with Aerith was a dream. But how is all this possible? How is a future version of Aerith communicating with Cloud's subconscious via the livestream? Well, The key word here is memories, just as she referenced earlier, although the compilation lore behind it is a bit more complex than you might expect. Unfortunately, to explain it fully in the context of Final Fantasy VII Remake, I would have to refer to content from later chapters. As such, for the sake of spoilers, I will leave this for another episode. The next morning, Cloud, Tifa and Barret thank Elmira for everything she has done for them, and, by extension, Marlene and Wedge. Elmira advises that she has been thinking about what Cloud said, most probably in respect to his outburst about Shinra scientists experimenting on people. This seems to have been the catalyst for her change of heart, about the others launching a rescue mission for Aerith, and I'll come back to the importance of this in a minute. Tifa also echoes Cloud's words that she feels Aerith is calling out to her, possibly suggesting the ex-soldier is not the only one who had a visitor in their dreams. Before they set off, Marlene runs downstairs to say goodbye. Barret does his best to explain to the young girl that he wishes he could stay with her, but to do so would mean abandoning the fight to help their friends and save the planet. Similar dialogue appears in the original game, but there, Barret uses it to try and justify his actions to Elmira rather than his daughter. When Barret goes to lift Marlene onto his shoulder, the camera lingers a moment on his chest, where his dog tags can be seen. The remake's material Ultimania confirms he wears two on the chain. One contains his details, the other contains Marlene's, presumably in case something happens to Barret while he's on an avalanche job. It's worth highlighting that while Marlene is up there, the conversation changes to Aerith. As it happens, the character wallpaper art for Barret in both Final Fantasy VII and its remake has him carrying Marlene on his shoulder while standing in the Sector 5 church, a location heavily associated with the Flower Girl. It's likely this scene is a nod to that artwork. I'd also like to note that both Elmira and Marlene ask the group to return to this place once they have saved Aerith, which does contradict the old game slightly. In the corresponding scene, Barret tells Elmira that it's too dangerous here, and insists that she takes Marlene somewhere else. This is why, at the climax of Final Fantasy VII, Marlene is shown to be in Calm rather than Midgar. And finally, before I conclude, I'm going to talk about Wedge. As veteran fans will know, the young revolutionary perishes during the collapse of Sector 7 in the original game, so it came as a surprise to many that he survives the disaster in Remake. I mentioned this briefly in the first part of my Chapter 13 breakdown, but the question becomes, does Wedge living play a deeper role in how events have transpired, and how they will continue to unfold moving forward? The answer is yes. Yes, it does. Unlike the old game, Elmira needed convincing that the best hope for Aerith was for Cloud, Tifa and Barret to rescue her. After her initial refusal in Chapter 13, she has conceded to the argument Cloud made at the beginning of this chapter. In essence, the story is now back on track. We already know from earlier in Remake that anytime the plot veers too wildly from the original games, the mysterious spectres intervene, and the same thing has happened here. At the end of Chapter 12, while the Sector 7 plate is plummeting towards the slums below, we are shown a trio of spectres encircling Wedge outside his home. The player discovers in Chapter 13 that he has somehow fallen into an area which is immediately adjacent to a deep ground experimentation site, and the party is led there by one of his cats. My friend and YouTuber Blitz has theorised that Wedge was in fact placed in the chamber by the spectres as a way of luring the party, because there is no obvious structural damage or sinkholes directly above his position. It's only after Wedge has been rescued and Cloud has the chance to glimpse the people in the Mako capsules that the spectres intervene again. It is suspiciously convenient that this is exactly what Elmira needed to learn to change her mind. Additionally, the fact that Wedge is still alive by the end of Chapter 13 strongly suggests the mysterious spectres will need him to course correct the plot again in future. Whether this relates solely to later chapters in Final Fantasy VII Remake, or to the episode Intermission DLC as well, itself known to run concurrently with these events and also feature Deep Ground, I'll address when the time comes. Well guys, this has been my recap of the compilation lore and Easter eggs from the opening of Chapter 14. I hope you've enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my own Patreon account, where you'll find free downloads of my unofficial novelisation of Final Fantasy VII, the Nibelheim incident, and so much more. Subscribers also get access to a huge amount of original content as well, including project artwork, behind the scenes podcasts, or mythology and Final Fantasy articles, etc. And please consider picking up a copy of my book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which will soon also be available in hardback. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, in association with KupoCon, and I'll speak to you again soon.